This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 93, brought to you in association with Blue Motor Finance and Smart Pension. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Max Pell, CEO of Validis, a fintech based in London and Austin, Texas, who allow SMEs to share seamlessly their accounting information with anyone they wish to. Clients include Barclays, RBS, most of the big four accountants, and a number of new fintech players. So we can assume that the Validis pipes down which data, the new oil, flows are well engineered. The backstory to the show is an interesting one. I met their chief revenue officer at Lendit. I would say I wonder what that is, but actually he is Danny Goll, a fan of the LFP, who chatted to me about things in general, as well as Validis. They seem to be a solid firm who help data flow, but being more of a tech fintech, not a core focus for the show. And I was busy at the time trying not to find new guests for the show. Anyway, subsequently I spoke to Max, their CEO, who suggested that they would be a good guest on the show and could speak about data. I instantly fell comatose, as we've all heard far too much about data and the big picture blah blah. Nothing wrong with the focus on data, but it isn't exactly the coalface of the LFP where, never leaving metaphors unmixed, think salad dressing, episodes are mostly about zooming in closely to one tiny piece of the mosaic that is London fintech. Even then the zooming often fails, as with last week's LFP092 on shareholder value, where I zoomed out, not in, and the prior week's zooming in to those strange foreign places, Berlin and Europe. I wonder whether the Tory right in passing might want to brick up the Channel Tunnel. Might be a plan, eh? Max, however, is a patient man and waited for me to come round and avoided using the D word for quite a while. What if the world isn't as we have been led to believe? What if the reality is that many fintechs are focused on being marketing machines and are not actually that data rich? For example, and especially in peer-to-peer. Well, that hooked me, as I've long felt intuited, being winked at, nudge nudge, that all these quotes, complex, unquotes credit models are not actually complex. What if the reality was that in new FS and old FS organisations alike, they have actually, away from the PR froth and hype, only started putting their toes in the shallow end, let alone actually swimming? What if, as Louise Beaumont was saying in LFP091, most organisations haven't grasped in the slightest the strategic and business-changing implications of data? Can we, as Edward Snowden and more senior ex-spy industry folks have argued, have too much data? Can we then start to lose the wood for the trees? This was much more interesting and definitely fits in with the LFP interest in, as much as possible, focusing on what's really happening and plays to the belief that in both old media and new/social media, we're fed a bunch of self-serving narratives that are a shell game to distract us from what's really going on. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Max, thanks for joining me today.
Hi Mike, thank you very much for having me here today.
So, in terms of something interesting to talk about on the show, not that data isn't fascinating, you're going to tell us how fascinating it is and how you adore spending your whole life surrounded by it, but I wanted something that wasn't FS, and you rather embarrassed me by sort of saying that you're relatively fit recently and you found a very interesting way of getting relatively fit.
Yeah, so when I'm not thinking about data and growing the business, I do like to try and get away from it all, and my top pleasure is cycling, and just come back from being in Southeast Asia where I've been cycling from Bangkok to Saigon through Cambodia, which was a very interesting experience, not least because it was incredibly hot and humid, so it was quite hard effort, and it was mad dogs and Englishmen out in the midday sun.
And how many miles is that?
You actually cycle around about 350 miles because some of the roads just aren't safe. So in Cambodia, for example, it's kind of one big road which is just not safe to cycle on, so you don't cycle the whole distance.
And was there you on your sort of push bike, or was the whole peloton of you?
There was about 25 of us, good mixed ability, because my wife was with me as well, so it meant that we could all cycle at our own pace. So yeah, there's about 30 of us.
Well, that's at the risk of starting this by complimenting a guest rather than short-pitch bowling at the guest, which is much more fun for me, of course. That's an incredible achievement because having been to a lot of that area and in Cambodia last year, it is incredibly sweltering. I mean, it's not
really
like doing
hot.
a couple of laps of the M25 on your bicycle where your main problem is avoiding the traffic and cops because you're not supposed to be cycling on M25, but it is hot, man.
There are lots of people getting on the bus, it has to be said.
Well, I remember watching Top Gear Vietnam where they took motorbikes the length of Vietnam, and they found that absolutely grueling, having engines in it. And so roughly, what was the sort of route?
You go from Bangkok and then you cycle south-east down to Siem Reap, so you go to Angkor Wat, and then you go again southeast. You then southeast down to the Mekong Delta, and then you cycle into Saigon. So it's fantastic.
Ah, right. Yes, I'm getting mixed up with my geography. I was thinking you were talking about Ho Chi Minh City because I was thinking you're not going to be anywhere near it. No, sorry, you are talking about Ho Chi Minh City.
Yes.
I was thinking you were talking about Hanoi.
No, but you can cycle from Saigon to Hanoi as well. That's a different trip.
Yes, that's right. That's the Top Gear trip. Well, actually, talking about Vietnam, I whinge about the media so much I really should stop it. But I saw a brilliant series recently on BBC 4. Actually, it was on iPlayer. I think it must have been made in America and it's probably available around the world, on the Vietnam War. It's a 10-part series, which was phenomenal TV. It was incredibly accurate, incredibly engaging and absolutely compulsory watching.
Well, it's very useful because we went to the Cu Chi tunnels and as part of the trip. So there's a lot of very interesting history. 1975 is quite an important year for both Cambodia and Vietnam.
Yes, incredibly. And this one of the things about this series that was sort of really rings true with it, there'd been less than a handful of similar series and other things I've seen. Was one example, and I've forgotten which the sort of president was at the time, the corrupt president of South Vietnam. But basically it was sort of the holiday season. We're just recording this a week or so before Christmas. It was the holiday season, and there was sort of some guy left in whatever the American equivalent of the Foreign Office is, manning the sort of Vietnam desk, and he got some telegram in or something, sort of hinting that maybe we should think about deposing the president of South Vietnam. And he drafted a reply saying, yeah, we've had enough of this jerk, just get rid of him. And because they were on holiday, this needed signing off before he sent it. So it was sent to Kennedy, who was on holiday, and having done risk in large banks, what they say in the army is quite true, which is assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. Kennedy assumed naturally that this had been processed and read by the head of the State Department, a whole bunch of folks, and his cabinet or whatever they have over there, and all that kind of stuff, and goes, oh, right, just signs it off. So at which point this, I don't know, it was a kid, but it wasn't a slightly senior person even, sends a telegram back to the sort of, CIA and co in South Vietnam, and lo and behold, before you know it, the president's deposed and there's sort of, absolute bloody chaos breaking out.
Shot in the back of a van.
Yeah, the sort of the cock-up theory of life. So it was phenomenal. The only problem I found watching it was that it was so gruelling and harrowing. I kept sort of popping into the kitchen for another G&T to be able to cope with the pain of watching what was really sort of happening. I mean, 3 million Vietnamese died, and it was a real civil war as well. It was terrible. So I did wake up with a headache the next day after watching one of the episodes. Right, so anyway, so you're nice and healthy and fit as a result of cycling through these places.
Fitter, I think. Fitter, not fit.
If I could cycle from Bangkok to Saigon, I think I'd definitely count myself as fit. But you're clearly very modest. I mean, actually, the war hasn't really finished for Cambodia, has it? Because I noticed recently, when I went to Cambodia, I was very surprised that basically the Khmer Rouge are still running it. So the dictator-y type person.
Hun Sen.
Yes, he's ex-Khmer Rouge, and he's recently banned the opposition as well.
Yeah, jailed the opposition, yeah. So it's still very much a one-party state.
Lovely people, but not the easiest gig to be born there. So coming nearer to home, we're in Waterloo at the moment. So I was about to say, how did you get from there to here? But not quite how did you get from there to here, because I assume it was an aeroplane. But in terms of your career journey, Max, you're now CEO of a company of 45 people, split across 2 countries. Were you always that, or did you start doing something else?
No, I've kind of got a quite unusual career journey. So I'm one of the few CEOs who studied drama at university. I saw some stats in the paper which said only 1% of drama students actually end up in business, and I think even fewer end up as CEOs. I spent the first 10 years of my career in catering, so I ran restaurants. I had my own restaurant and wine bar for 5 years. I worked in the charity sector, and it wasn't until I was reasonably aged at 37 that I actually started moving into the corporate world and joined Hiscox, an insurance company based in London, and spent 5 years there. I then went on to work for technology and business processing businesses, and then decided I'd had enough of big corporate life and took some time out to do some more cycling, so Land's End to John O'Groats, and then set out to land exactly the job that I've got, which is to be the CEO of a fintech.
Ah, and well, as you say, that's a very sort of rare journey. I haven't had one of those before. And so when you were managing not quite piss-up in breweries, but piss-ups in wine bars, what was it about the sort of the drama and the catering world that you eventually tired of and you thought, oh, insurance sounds really fascinating. I always want to be insurance.
I see the way I try and pull a constant theme through all of that is all about customer service and focusing on customer excellence. So that's how I kind of try and explain what looks on the face of it quite unusual, But fundamentally, I mean, for 10 years I was running a small business. So again, that was all about cash flow and the things that I need to be worried about now, which is preserving cash and making sure that we grow the business in an appropriate way. What fundamentally interests me is working for companies that are trying to be excellent and do something in an excellent way, and Hiscox is a really good example of it. So I didn't know anything about insurance, but I like the fact the offices were covered in fine art.
Yes, I remember those days. I didn't know they still existed, but it is interesting in terms of how fintech is maturing, that you're getting grown-ups into the business, whether they are grown-ups with deep backgrounds in FS as opposed to a 22-year-old.
Yeah.
Along with 22-year-olds, they just have got about 1 year in FS if they're lucky. Or like yourself, people who have actually managed businesses and know what businesses are. And for some time, fintech avoided the whole sort of business vibe because that's, unhip and uncool and all this profit stuff that's just kind of not very creative, is it? But actually, surprise, surprise, as time goes by, even the sort of VCs start wanting some sort of money out of it.
I mean, we have a lot of money behind us and we have very ambitious plans as to how we want to grow the business. So we need grown-ups running the business.
Excellent. Right. Okay, then. So that sounds wonderful. But of course, you've now set yourself up as a grown-up who knows something and can add value. So we shall now give you a little test. We'll have
That's
a little viva. I'll mention the data word because you can actually talk about the Realpolitik and how it's more interesting than all the sort of LinkedIn thought leaders about, it's the new oil, it's the future of business and all this kind of stuff. So let's start with this point, which was the one that sort of hooked my interest, which is that, not unsurprisingly, what you might read or hear about data is one thing, but there's actually quite a gap between that and reality. So there's lots of froth and lots of hype at the moment, but you're telling me or telling us that reality is very different.
Yes, so if you think about the area that we operate in, which is providing financial and accounting data, all of our customers have developed processes based on what's available today. So what's available today is fairly skinny. It will be the stuff that's at company's house, or it might be an Excel file. And all their processes are built around having a limited set of data. So actually one of the challenges when we're able to serve up the whole financial history of a business is, it sounds quite interesting, but for our customers, the first question is, well, what do I do with it? I can imagine what I might be able to do with it, but I don't actually have systems that can consume that easily. I haven't built my underwriting process or my audit processes around that. So on the one hand, it sounds very exciting, but on the other hand, I think some of them scratch their heads and think, well, yes, but how am I going to consume this and how am I going to make use of it in my business? And even today with some of our best customers, we probably only utilise maybe 25%, 30% of the data that we can give them simply because they don't have the technology and operational processes yet to be able to consume all of the data.
Right. So let's slice and dice that into the different areas. And I think obviously that's a very good overview. The impossible question, which I've never really seen answered, but maybe it's an unfair question, in which case it's a very good one to ask, because I like asking unfair questions. Fair questions I can generally predict the answer to. But what percentage of, let's call it relevant financial data, or just financial data that exists in all the SMEs in the UK, say, what percentage of that do you think actually flows these days to, let's say, consumers, be it accountants? Well, accountants are different because they've got to add up all the numbers and check expenditures, put them to one side. But let's just say sort of banks and fintechs or something like that.
Well, I think you could even include accountants because at the moment they still don't get the full transactional history. They tend to sample data rather than to look at the full set of data because they don't have a method at the moment, although most of them are developing methods, to consume all of the data. If you had to take a rough number, of the available data, it's probably somewhere between 5 and 10% that's actually being consumed, which goes back to my previous point about that's a limited data set. New tools like ours allow you to access the whole data set, and how am I, as the consumer of that data, going to make use of it?
Oh, interesting. Well, of course, having been a very small business myself for the last 20 years, I just keep a spreadsheet of expenditures and revenues and bank account and things like that, and it's actually fairly easy. And I, of course, email 100% of the data I've got to my accountants.
Yes.
But it isn't very much for them to process. Interestingly enough, Bridget, my partner, she's got sort of hooked on being sold that you need an accounting package, and not unsurprisingly, in my estimation, the overhead of sticking all the things in the format you want, and then the lack of transparency and the difficulty of dealing with a software package, albeit a good one, is too much of a sledgehammer for a sort of single person.
Absolutely.
Frankly, the average quarter, I probably don't have 10 expenditure items or something like that.
You're not a heavy transaction business.
But of course, there are businesses bigger than one person, and then there really is a lot of data. And in terms of how accountants do it, I've never actually asked about the minutiae, other than being well aware, of course, that when it comes to auditing, then you randomly stick your hand in and you pull something out and you check whether that's right, and you put your hand in again and pull something else out.
Well, if I can give you an example, I mean, one of the clients that we worked for this week, for example, we had just a year's worth of data, had 4 million transactions. Now, that quantum of data is something that would never have had access to before. So they're suddenly served up with 4 million data points, and the question is, what do I do with 4 million data points? I certainly won't be able to consume it manually, but I can consume it through analytics packages, through deal origination platforms. It kind of leads on to AI and machine learning and robotics, because they're the only kind of tools that can consume that volume of data.
Yes. Okay, so the first point is that of the stuff that you see, you're estimating 5 to 10% of it is actually practically consumed. My feeling more generally, just in terms of data in the broader context, is that the square root of point fuck all is actually flowing around and being utilised.
Yeah.
So hence saying at the start that I think it really is in practice just toes in the water. We'll come on to peer-to-peers and all that kind of thing later, but I can't believe that many credit models have, shall we say, got more than 50 or certainly not more than 100 data points, and certainly old school credit managers never used anything like that. So let's talk about this angle first though, which is that not much data is used. And then let's say Validis have got a magic wand and everybody buys your product on the 2nd of January and they use it, and all SMEs share all of their data. Then suddenly everybody's got an infinite amount of data, and that sounds nice, unless you're the poor sod who's actually got to deal with it all. And as I mentioned, big data to me really seems to be driven by the massive surveillance state, and many people in the surveillance industry have argued, I believe rightly, that they are literally in danger of making it an ever bigger haystack to look for a needle. And of course it tends to be the old school spies, but old school spies say there's no alternative for what used to happen in the past, and therefore in this massive data you can lose what you want. Putting surveillance and spying to one side, you can clearly have the same problem, as you say, which is if suddenly you get flooded with data, how the hell do you find out what's relevant? AI is fine, but as Tristan Fletcher described some time ago on the show, the last thing you want is some machine learning AI package that you don't really understand from Google and Amazon and just chuck a ton of data at it, because then you're going to end up with some pretty weird results. Can you get too much data in practice?
So I think the answer to that is no.
You can't get too much data.
I don't think so. You do need to have the appropriate AI tools. And there is the challenge with AI and ML, which is initially you're suspicious if you don't understand what's going on in the black box. And what people tend to do is they run processes in parallel. But, it's be kind of restricting where the future is going to go if you say we're not going to use AI across lots of data, because that is exactly, and we're seeing this already with our client base. So a lot of our client base is accessing our data to feed into their analytics packages to use AI. But why are they doing this? It's about a value exchange. If I give you my data, can you give me some insight into my business? Tell me something about my business that I didn't know that will help me run my business in a more efficient way. Or for our lenders, it might be, because I understand you a lot better, I'm prepared to give you a loan at a preferential rate, or perhaps lend you more money than you actually initially requested. So it has to be a value exchange. There has to be something quantitatively different. And one of the kind of straplines we talk about is about facilitating better relationships. This is about stopping our clients having to do a lot of grunt work, which is really just to try to get the data into some sort of shape, and actually getting them into a position where they can share some real deep insights into their clients about how their businesses are performing.
Yes, absolutely. So, obviously your clients are more focused on this kind of thing, so they're a sort of maybe unrepresentative subset, because the ones who really aren't on the case aren't thinking about you guys. And so I'm happy to expect that the likes of Big Four and that are on the case, and they've been dealing with data for quite a long time, because basically they've been adding it up for centuries and making sure it adds up correctly, so they're a bit sort of hotter. But I can imagine that for a large number of financial organisations that they can actually in practice be given too much data too fast.
They can certainly be given data faster than they can consume it.
Yes.
But I think it's a question of how long it's going to take them to change their models to be able to consume that data. And we're seeing this with the very large organisations like Experian and FICO. They're gearing up to be able to do that, to provide those services to their clients.
Yes, and then you get the question of, in terms of building models, the AI can just be a bit of a sort of black box, as you say. But in terms of building practical models, is working out how many data points you're going to integrate in your model. Now, I know a very large bank, I won't mention which one because I was told confidentially, who's just started an N-year gazillion-dollar project basically to get rid of all their credit analysts.
Absolutely.
By clever back blocks instead. Now, it'd be very interesting to see how far that goes. Talking of peer-to-peer, it's been a rather sort of obvious thing for many years, which is that in the US they've got more confidence in tech, and they are, by and large, just generalising, the US peer-to-peers are more into, oh yes, the computer can work it out, whereas the UK, it tends to be the opposite direction, which is the computer can't completely work it out. A good example was I spoke recently at a commercial real estate conference about what was going on in tech in general. And in the UK, because the housing stock is so varied, in many roads, mine's a good example, you absolutely can't use the computer to predict the price because every house is very different. The range is quite wide.
But the problem there is lack of data. Not that the computer can't do it, it's the data is not granular enough for you to do it. Not that the computer can't do it. And that's a great example of where you needed a higher level of granularity. So, for example, the postcode is not a high enough granularity for the computer to do it. However, a down to a centimetre map with an exact understanding of mapping would be. And that's a really good example of where true granular data would allow the computer to do it.
So this is an interesting debate because basically that's what I've heard time and time again at sort of peer-to-peer conferences and all that kind of stuff, which is that, you know, by and large the Americans, and you guys are sort of got an office over there, so you're exposed to this culture, have got great faith that enough data means the computer can work it out. Although, as I say, I do pay a lot of interest to the likes of Snowden and co, who argue that actually too much data is too much data no matter how many computers you've got. Versus the Brits who say that actually no amount of data is enough. And just, I mean, you need to move your tanks to a different ground to have this battle because I know my road very well. And you don't, so it's an unfair way of discussing it. But you could, for example, on my road go down the number of bedrooms. You know, that tends to vary quite a lot, so that would be more data, and you can go about the square metres and yardy. But then you get into the sort of different architectural styles, because it used to be woodland. My house was woods about 40 years ago, and it sort of gradually varied. So I still feel, and this is my feeling, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that there are some cases where you're going to need a human, in terms of estate agent, on some areas, to value it, because it's a very liquid market. Many houses on my road haven't sold for 25 years. It's a real finger in the wind. And there are things like there aren't many rental properties in the area. There's lots of other factors like that.
But at the end of the day, that estate agent is a human computer who's taking a whole series of variables and making a decision. It's just a question, can I get those variables as data points?
Exactly.
That's it.
Exactly. And again, mentioning this real estate conference I was at, there were lots of people sort of saying, oh yes, it's perfectly possible. But I started my career in computing, and I remember that sort of one of the guys was doing a project in Prolog at the time when expert systems were all the rage. That was a thing that's been flogged in the 80s. And, expert systems, you interview your expert, whether it's a sort of a retail finance person or whether it's a real estate agent or whatever, and you capture all of his knowledge and how he's making his decisions and you write it down. And that was by and large a complete failure at the time.
Certainly in our customer base, we already have customers where the decision making is completely automated. And there are a number of the fintechs which do not rely on humans. They rely on algorithms and financial models and data points in order to approve loans. And certainly with our conversations with the big banks, that's an area that they want to move in. And again, it's about exceptions. The great bulk of loans are actually very straightforward loans based on not that many data points. And we see that's the way that the market going is I as a consumer would like to get my loan approved immediately. I want to access money today, and those offers are already out there and functioning.
Absolutely, and I've had many guests on the show that have that kind of model. Means you can do the turnaround. Equally, I've had many guests on the show who say, look, we're never going to get rid of the people because in this business, for whatever reason, and it may be right or wrong, in 5 years' time they may be wiped out. We need human beings. So as it exists today, the tide is moving up the beach. How far the tide gets, we shall see. And in particular, as I say, it's highly pertinent because it's a vast bank I'm thinking of. High up in the vast bank, they've got an idea of replacing all their credit analysts at $1 gazillion. And of course, the credit people that I know have a different view, which is they may replace quite a lot of us, but they're not replacing.
They won't replace all of them, no.
Not least of which, because this comes back to the modelling as a whole, the most important point about modelling is that a model works extremely well for a period of time. I haven't been in finance for over 30 years, and then every model comes across a new world when it doesn't. Of course. An Icelandic volcano blew up and actually air travel is no longer possible in Europe or the UK leaves Brexit. The models actually change. And in those circumstances, you need a human being standing there saying, oh, this model's done fantastically for 15 years. But do you know what?
Yeah.
We can't tell it about Brexit or the volcano. Let's actually turn it off for 5 minutes and do it ourselves. Okay, so that's an interesting debate, and we'll all see over time how far the water goes. So we start off by the fact that the hype is very different to the reality. The reality is that only a tiny percentage of data is actually currently utilised. I raised the question about can you have too much data? And then we're talking about how much you can actually do with data and where human beings fit in at all, or will we all be left sort of sitting on the sort of sofa while the computers run everything? One of the interesting things that also you were sort of hooking my fascination with was the point that the narrative is that one of the things that fintech does is it embraces data. It embraces the new digital world. It's got very clever people with very clever computers and all this kind of stuff, extremely sophisticated. Whereas in reality, allegedly or apparently, some of this is kind of marketing hype and they don't actually use 1 million data points on every decision.
Yeah, well, I think you need to understand, what is a fintech, what is any kind of new delivery mechanism there to do? And it's to improve a current customer experience or to provide a new service that you can't buy today. Now, some of those require lots of data points, but some of them don't require lots of data points. So there is quite a high percentage of the new alt finance players who are actually trying to say, I'm looking for the minimum number of data points that I can safely lend money on. And I've had some interesting conversations with those guys where they've said, actually, please don't give me any more data.
This is my point.
My model is not based on lots of data. My model is actually based on what's the minimum set of data on which I'm prepared to make a lending decision. And that's a very different approach to a traditional bank, which with its traditional risk management, which says, I want as much data as possible to make sure that I'm making a credible difference. And of course, for a lot of the new players, this is a land grab. This is a very competitive space. There's 157 plus alt-fi players, and they're all scrambling for market share in the same market. So actually, for some of those players, requesting more data is the last thing they want. They want to make it as easy and seamless as possible to lend the money. And if I can only ask 4 questions, I will only ask 4 questions, because that's all I need in my model.
Yes, I've been told 1 or 2 examples of this recently, which I can't mention because I was told in confidence, but there is this absolute trade-off between, as it were, the speed of moving your tanks across Europe or wherever versus the thoroughness of how you're doing it. And going back to your point about more data is generally good, which I agree with. I'm rephrasing it. But if I'm doing a new fintech tomorrow and I want Max to sign up, I want Max's journey to last about 2 minutes. Obviously, from my perspective, or from my credit analyst perspective or whatever, they would get more if you spent 22 minutes entering stuff into a form, but I'm unlikely to capture as many clients with that.
Hopefully what our offering does says that you can still have a very quick process, yet get all the data.
That sounds like a really good marketing line, actually.
It is, yeah.
Have you thought that one before? Right, okay, so yes, so interesting. I haven't really seen that mentioned, although I've heard it rumoured and things, that actually many fintechs are not data rich and are deliberately trying not to be data rich because they're in a marketing mode, because they're trying to make the customer journey simpler. So there is a trade-off of customer journey versus the richness with which you know them. And as you can explain later about Validis, you guys in some ways are helping them square the circle and do both at the same time. Then just briefly, because we've sort of touched on this one before, but the other question is, if you suddenly connect a pipeline into an organisation or a fintech and you're suddenly providing 1,000 times more data flow per minute than they had before, they need something sort of at the other end which is going to be able to accept that, and obviously that in itself can be a challenge. So briefly, in terms of the customers that you've seen and their journey, how do they actually manage that? Let's say I sign up with you tomorrow and I've got infinitely more data about everybody who wants to come on the show. I go, oh my God, I'm just overwhelmed.
There's 2 key ways. The first thing they'll do is they'll take the set of data that they already use, and instead of having to manually key in that data, they'll just extract that data via API. So that's kind of a starting point.
That's automation of the core tasks of the business.
Automation of the core tasks of the business. The second point is there are a lot of businesses out there selling analytics packages and machine learning packages, and certainly our clients really like them, but the problem is I describe them as like having a beautiful Ferrari, but you have to hand push it because you can't fuel the Ferrari, and we're kind of the digital fuel. So what we enable them to do is to use these new tools and get real value from them, because now they've got deep, rich data to power their analytics platforms or to power their decision-making platforms. So we help them link the 2 things together. We can be the data pipe, and that can help them use these other third-party tools to accelerate their business model.
And other angles are using data for a better customer relationship.
Fundamentally what our business is about, it's about helping our clients having a better, deeper relationship with their clients. So it's moving, whether it's a bank or an auditor or any of our customers, to actually move to be a value-added service provider rather than doing a lot of grunt transactional work which doesn't actually add any real value. It allows the lender or the accountant to do their job, but it's not adding any value to the SME. So how can we help you move up that value cycle and become more of a valued customer to the bank or the auditor, because you're getting something real back that helps you run your business better?
Yes, and in terms of finance, which has been around for a long time, I mean, if we go back to, it's Christmas, if we go back to sort of Charles Dickens' time, you've got quill pens and books.
Yeah.
You know, some people are just employed as monkeys, basically. Well, actually, monkeys can't write. That's a really bad metaphor. Never mind. As monkeys who can write, just to write down stuff in books, and other people are to check it's right, and that kind of stuff. Now, that seems incredibly antiquated, but nevertheless, fast forward to today, there are plenty of people in finance whose job is not a lot different from a quill pen and a book, writing it down, even if it is Excel and typing at a keyboard. So Louise Beaumont, when she was talking about open banking, was positing that a number of banks haven't really gripped the fact that open banking isn't just about data or tech or regulation, but actually is about strategy and how you can reform your whole business and reimagine it and all that kind of stuff. And so there's huge strategic implications for boards of any size of organisation. But equally, just hearing you talk there and using it in caricature terms, if you're currently hiring people to act as monkeys, but this is increasingly being automated, then there's a whole HR/personnel angle here, which is, do you need a bunch of different people going forward, or do you need to train the ones you've got to go up the value chain?
You need to do both of those. So there's definitely, this is a productivity play, so apparently in the UK we're not very productive.
I never believe productivity numbers whatsoever, actually.
Neither do I.
Vastly large number divided by another vastly large number, and it goes up and goes down.
It certainly doesn't match my experience, where everybody seems to be much more productive.
Exactly,
we all seem
yes.
to be doing a lot more things, so I'm not quite sure.
30 years ago, you go out for a long lunch. I mean, when I started in computing, we go to the pub for a few beers at lunchtime. That doesn't happen anymore.
So in terms of your question, I think there's definitely a reduction in the amount of headcount you need to serve the client base, and it's also about moving people up the value chain. But certainly for most of our clients, I'll give you a good example. So a major bank, they're very excited because their relationship managers are now going to spend a lot less time gathering information, and the first time they meet their clients, they're actually going to have a presentation for those clients about, let me tell you about what I understand about your business. So that's good for everybody, because the relationship manager doesn't enjoy doing the grunt work, they don't get any value from it, and now they're going to turn up to their client and have a much better informed conversation.
Yes, and I think that's quite a nice way to wrap up this section, which is that, as I said, when I just first met you guys superficially, you looked like a sort of tech fintech. You've got this nice piece of tech that does stuff. But actually, that is just a tool to enable, as you say, a phase change in businesses and a phase change in people's occupation in FS to be doing much more value-added work and much less just sort of basically data-level work. And that's clearly very important. So before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there and my brand partners for the podcast, Blue Motor Finance, who combine extensive experience with a fresh and innovative approach. Blue's award-winning technology has supported over £500,000 of lending to over 50,000 customers. Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrollment.co.uk. So, Max, you survived this far without me going comatose, and I hope too many members of the audience haven't gone comatose. I'm sure they haven't. And it's been interesting to hear about the Realpolitik. You sneaked the odd mention of Validis into your general theme, but maybe you'll just tell us sort of more specifically, in a nutshell, where you guys are at, where you're going, and in particular in terms of the fishes of the ocean that will be paying attention to the breadcrumbs thrown. What breadcrumbs do you want to throw them at?
We're rapidly expanding in the UK and in the US. We've got an ambition to have 50% market share in the area that we specialise in. We're great believers about being in a category of one.
I was going to say, what percentage have you got at the moment? 100%.
We kind of define that in two ways. In terms of, if you take, for example, that the big 4 or 5 banks have 85% of the lending market, then by the end of this year, we will have 4 of those banks as a client. So we will be beyond our 50% share in terms of contracting with people who have access to the market. We're growing very rapidly in the US, so we're speeding up our growth in people in both the UK and the US. If there's anybody listening whose appetite's been whetted, please visit www.validis.com and find out more about our services. And we're very interested to talk to people who might want to become part of our ecosystem, because effectively we're a data provider, and we have lots of partners who want to provide services to SMEs, to banks, or to anybody who's interested in financial information. And if anybody out there would like to be part of our ecosystem, we'd love to talk to them.
Excellent. Well, whatever data is going to be, and however far the tide goes up the beach or not, and whether there's any sand left at the end of it, clearly you're absolutely at the heart of it all. And as I say, I particularly like the fact that you do cover the waterfront from technology. It's always sounds easier than it actually is to make all this stuff flow well. We haven't spoken about data cleansing and putting it in nice usable format and all that kind of stuff, which people can check out themselves. So there's the tech end that's well covered, but there's also the kind of what this means for a business perspective. And I think that, going back to where we started about your background in business as a whole, things like wine bars and that kind of stuff, I think it's your grasp of business per se, which really puts this into the appropriate context, far away from sort of LinkedIn so-called thought leader pieces. And it's very interesting for me to find out that what I just suspected is actually kind of true, which is that in terms of the journey, even in fintech, quote unquote, it's really only just started and there's plenty of distance to go. So I wish you every success in the future, Matt.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. To come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.